Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little. Hope you're all having a fantastic day. Seems like the webinar program is active, so that is good. That is good, good, good. Today, we're going to be answering one of your most frequently asked questions, and it's pertaining to rejamming strategies. So, here's your question. Can you discuss the idea of rejamming in the middle or late stages of tournaments? It would be helpful to have general guidelines for spots to look for and stack sizes where it makes sense. Okay. So first things first, what is a rejam? Many people do not even know what a rejam is. I do want to make it clear that I do not love this term, but a rejam is when you 3-bet all in over a raise. In theory, isn't that just a jam? Well, whatever. They call it a rejam. So if someone raises and then you push all in, that's a rejam. So someone raises to 2 big blinds, you go all in for 20, you just rejam them. I just prefer to say I went all in over them, but whatever. This is what people say. All right. So when should you make this play? Well, you should tend to 3-bet all in with hands that have plenty of equity, but play poorly post-flop, especially with a medium stack like 20, 25 big blinds. Okay? You should tend to 3-bet all in when you do not have the option to 3-bet and then fold to a 4-bet all in. So realize that with like a 40 big blind stack, if someone raises, you can still 3-bet with hands that you plan to fold if your opponent 4-bets. Okay? So that's not a stack that you want to be doing a whole lot of jamming with. And also, with a 40 big blind stack, you're risking a lot to win relatively little. That said, you could profitably jam all in with aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king, right? Those are profitable shoves. You will make money by shoving in those spots, but it is definitely not the best play. It's very important to realize that just because a play makes money does not mean it is the best option, right? This is a spot where a lot of people get themselves in trouble. Like with a 15 big blind stack, when someone raises, you can still just call, even though you have a stack that could rejam, right? Remember, you're allowed to make plays besides all in or fold whenever you get somewhat shallow. And we're going to take a look at the game theory optimal strategies in just a second that make this very, very clear. So recognize that you need to always consider all of your options. And typically the hands to 3-bet all in with are the hands that you don't really want to 3-bet fold, but still have plenty of equity. This is going to end up being stuff like small and medium pairs, ace-x, big cards, right? So you should also be more inclined to call as your position and equity realization improve. So as you get in later positions, meaning you're going to be in position throughout the hand, you should be a little bit more inclined to call as opposed to shove all in because position is very, very valuable. And also, as your hand just flops better, like suited connected type hands, those hands are usually going to prefer calling as opposed to jamming, especially the good ones, right? So let's take a look at these charts. These charts are available on PokerCoaching.com in the premium section, I think, although maybe they're available for everyone now. Let's take a look at the 15 big blind GTO strategy, okay? This may be a little bit small for all of you, but if you want, you can just go to the tool section. It's where it's currently listed. It may be changed in the future. And download these charts directly to your computer. They're all there for you. Download them to your phone, take screenshots, do whatever you need. So, as you see with the 15 big blind stack, the GTO strategy, when under the gun raises and you are under the gun +1. So this is when first position raises at a 9-handed table, you're in second position, you have no calling range. So let's think about this. Does this make logical sense with the guidelines I just gave? Well, are we in position? I mean, we're in position against the raiser, but there's still a lot of people yet to act, so we don't really want to do a whole lot of calling here. As you see, there is no calling. It's all in or fold. Next, can we 3-bet fold off the stack? And the answer is basically no. If our opponent raises to 2 big blinds, we make it 6 or 5, we really can't justify folding when it gets back to us because if we do face a shove, because then we're getting 2-to-1 pot odds, right? We then have to put in 10 big blinds to win a total of 30. So do we have 33% equity with all these hands? Ace-10 suited better, ace-queen offsuit better, queen-jack suited, king-jack suited, and pocket eights and better? And the answer is just yes. All these hands are going to have 30% equity. So in this scenario, it makes a whole lot of sense to have no flatting range. Same story against under the gun and the hijack seat. No flatting range. What about in the hijack against the low jack? Well, now you still have to worry about the cutoff and the button calling as well as the blinds. Still, no need to have a calling range. So we're all in or folding. This is all rejams. Now you may be thinking this is very different than how a lot of small stakes players play because they do a whole lot of calling. Whenever someone raises, they never go all in. And well, they're making mistakes, right? It's important to realize and be happy about the facts that your opponents are making mistakes on a regular basis. Same thing, cut off against under the gun, we're just all in. Cut off against low jack, we're just all in. Button though. Now, you see we get to start flat calling some. So, notice here we're flat calling with pocket aces, because aces flops very well. King, queen makes good top pairs. Ace 8, ace 9, ace 8, ace 5 suited. These make top pairs, flush draws, etc. Jack 10 suited, 10 9 suited, 9 8 suited. These flop very well. And then these small pairs, 5s and 4s, we are basically getting slightly better than break-even implied odds to call. Now again, this is facing a min raise off a 15 big blind stack with antes in play. This is not facing a 3 big blind raise. We'd be tighter in that scenario, right? And many of these hands in blue would just become jams or not played. Button versus low jack and button versus cutoff, you see the ranges getting even a little bit wider, right? And notice the presence of the pocket ace is protecting every time in the flatting range. That's mainly just to allow you to flat call with more hands. As you are using different options, like calling in this scenario, you should be more inclined to trap with some of the best hands, usually just aces, pre-flop, in order to allow you to call with a few more weaker hands. Calling with some nut hands protects your calling range so your opponents just can't blindly barrel you every single time because every once in a while you just have the aces, right? All right, so let's now take a look at strategies from the blinds, right? Now, at this point, we are closing the action a little bit more, right? So now, small blind against under the gun, you actually see you're supposed to call quite a bit. And you may say, why? Well, that's because under the gun is opening with a pretty strong range, right? So we can't just blindly jam them too wide, but we're also getting pretty good odds to call. Right? So in that scenario, we get to flat call a decent amount of the time. And you see the hands we're flat calling with all flop pretty well. What about big blind versus under the gun? Same story, right? Now we're getting amazing odds to call, so we really don't want to screw that up. And again, this presumes everyone folds around to us. I want to make that very clear. I always presume that's obvious. These charts presume someone raises, everyone else folds. If someone raises and there's like 6 callers, these charts go out the window. If someone raises and there's 1 caller, these charts go out the window. All right, next, as you see, small blind versus low jack, we probably want to do a little bit less calling now. You may say, why less calling now? What changed? Well, what changed was the fact that the initial raiser is now raising with a wider range, which means we have more fold equity, right? And as you see, that makes sense, right? We have all in now 14% and 10% small blind compared to big blind. Before we had 9 and 7. So you see the all-in range got bigger. And that's going to hold true as we move to the cutoff raise and the button raise. You see now, cutoff raises small blind jams 22%, button raises small blind jams 28%. Makes sense, right? Because we're jamming into weaker ranges compared to against under the gun. Same thing, same story is going to check out big blind versus cutoff, big blind versus button. So that all makes logical sense. And again, these are the implementable GTO strategies. I don't want to make that clear. Like, for example, John says, is there a reason why you call 6s and 2s, but not 3s and 5s, 3s to 5s in this scenario? Most likely on the GTO strategy, the actual GTO strategy, 6s, 5s, 4s, 3s, and 2s were all mixed. You're probably supposed to flat them sometimes, and you're supposed to jam them sometimes. So let's say they're each supposed to be jammed 60%, called 40%. Well, what's the easy way to balance that? Well, you just do 2 of them, 40% of them, you call every time, and then you jam the other ones, the other 3 every time. So these are implementable charts. These are not perfect GTO charts. These are not what Monk or Solver will give you if you ask it to give you the actual GTO chart. They're going to have it all mixed. And that's fine, right? It's as long as you are not playing against like the absolute best players in the world who recognize, all right, he jams sixes or he calls sixes but not fives, right? Your opponents won't know how the board coverage lines up for you. And as you see, like it's kind of a smattering of stuff over here, right? Where like why queen 9 suited, right? Probably because king 9, queen 8, queen 10, probably all those were jammed some portion of the time. So pick one. And having a very clearly defined chart it makes it way, way easier for you to actually do it. One problem with the vast majority of poker training sites out there that try to teach high level poker is that essentially what happens is, let's see what's happening here. What happens is people will try to teach a strategy that says, let's say you're supposed to, like the sixes to twos example, let's say you're supposed to flat call 40% of the time across the board. People just can't actually do that in game, right? They just can't. So they end up jamming every time, or they end up calling every time, and then they just make mistakes. So this is not a perfect strategy, but all of the frequencies here, like right here, 9.5% and 11.2% are like plus or minus 0.2% from the actual GTO ranges. And they're used with hands that are mostly used in the GTO strategy. So again, implementable charts. If you print these out, you won't go all that wrong. And there will be some random outliers, but that's okay. Like right here is where we really start to see a mess. Here we have small blind. If everyone folds to you in the small blind and you're playing against the big blind, you see why this selection, why this smattering over here, and why these? Well, all of these are probably jam some portion and limp some portion, but you combine it. And again, all of the frequencies here are what the solvers suggest, which is really the most important thing. Small blind versus big blind, 3 big blind raise. So here, small blind limps with the hands in blue. Big blind makes it 3 big blinds. How do you reply? Well, now you're jamming with some hands. Which hands do you want to jam with? Ones that have decent equity, right? The ace X, king high, queen high, but play poorly post flop. Remember we discussed that earlier. You want to be jamming with the hands that have equity but play poorly. And like pairs, right? If you limp call the hand like pocket sevens and the flop comes with high cards, you're going to play poorly. So you'd rather just get it all in with its immediate equity, right? And then here's big blind strategy, but that's not so relevant. So this is the spot. These are the spots. The 15 big blind strategy that I think a lot of people do pretty well. And to be fair, if you do just never flat call in these scenarios, you see it's not going to be all that big of a deal. So with a 15 big blind stack, you could just use a purely jamming strategy over a raise. Notice though that, like right here in the button versus cutoff, if you wanted to have no flat calling range, you'd have to be a little bit tighter than this. So what would essentially happen is some of the hands on the cusp, like probably ace-6 suited, queen-9 suited, king-jack offsuit, maybe pocket threes, would become folds, which means you get to play fewer hands profitably. And yes, you are making an error, but it's not a gigantic error, but it is still an error. So what happens is instead of getting to play 19% of hands profitably, you may only get to play 17% of hands profitably. And you may think that's not such a big deal, but in reality, it kind of is, because you're playing actually like 10% fewer hands. Because if we're normally playing 19, but now we're playing 17 divided by 19 is like 90% or whatever it is. So we're only playing 90% of the hands that we previously were. So we're giving up 10% profitable scenarios. And that does matter in the long term. And you have to realize, even if making a play wins you like 0.05 big blinds, it's actually a reasonable amount of money whenever you're talking about only a 15 big blind stack total. So that matters. So I would definitely suggest that you follow these charts to some extent. Now, be careful with these charts because these presume your opponents play GTO themselves, which your opponents don't, right? If under the gun raises, and we're on the button, and under the gun's reasonable in live poker, I can guarantee you I'm not jamming all these hands in red. I'm probably going to be doing a little bit more flat calling because people typically play poorly in general. So I'm going to do a little bit more flat calling with stuff like king 10 suited, queen 10 suited, ace 10 suited, ace jack offsuit maybe. And I'm really just jamming these pretty high equity hands. I'm probably going to call sevens and sixes. So I'm jamming something like eights or better, king jack suited, maybe not even king jack suited, maybe like ace jack suited, king queen suited, ace queen suited, ace king, and king ace queen, then flatting some of these other hands. And yes, that's exploitatable, but again, I don't think the small blind and big blind are going to pick up on that fact, so they're not going to start jamming too wide. And the initial raiser is usually going to bet the flop. I'm going to call a lot, and then we're going to see what develops. So recognize that your opponents don't play GTO, so don't think you're just supposed to blindly play a GTO strategy every time, because that will leave money on the table. But it's important to have a rough guideline of what you need to be doing. And a lot of people just kind of wing it. Or worse, they download a chart that has reshoving apps. There's a popular app that's out there. And I always hope they're just going to write their ways instead of teaching them to put their buyers' money right into the dumpster. But they are suggesting purely reshove only strategies. And that's a problem. Because if you only jam or fold, then you're never using the call option. Which, like I said, isn't that big of a deal for 15 big blinds, but they're like actively advertising 20, 25 big blind strategies. So let's take a look at the 20 big blind strategy real quick. And now, let's go back over here to the the ideas. When you do not have the option to 3-bet and fold, and also recognize that calling is an option, right? So as you get deeper and deeper, calling becomes more of an option. You can take this to the extreme, right? Say you have 100 big blinds and someone raises. You're not just jamming it all in. Even though, again, you could profitably jam aces and kings, right? But you're not doing it because it's really, really, really bad. So let's take a look at this. With these stacks now, we have a few options. We can jam all in, or we can 3-bet with the intention of calling sometimes, the intention of folding sometimes, or we can call, right? So under the gun versus under the gun +1, this strategy suggests 3-betting small with aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king, looking to call off, and then 3-betting small with ace, queen, queen, jack suited, king, jack suited, king 10 suited, ace 9 suited, looking to fold if you get jammed on, while flat calling with the hands in blue. Okay, so there's no all-in strategy here. Why? Because we don't want to jam into what's presumably a strong range, but we do want to 3-bet our best hands and just get them in for 25 big blinds. In live poker, again, maybe you don't want to get it all in with jacks. Maybe you don't want to get it all in with ace, king offsuit, right? Maybe you think your opponent's range is really strong and you don't want to be 3-betting ace 9 suited. You just want to fold it, right? That's fine. So realize that those are options. Next, hijack versus under the gun. Now you see the addition of an all-in strategy. Now, I was debating whether or not I wanted to have these in the implementable GTO charts, because you actually see the hands in red here, the all-in ranges are very, very small. Very, very, very small. And usually they're made up of one good hand and one bad hand paired together, right? It's like right here we have one good hand, ace king paired with one, call it a bad hand, king queen suited. Here we have ace king paired with queen jack suited in pocket tens. Here we have jacks and tens paired with queen jack suited, right? And so essentially you are bluffing some tiny portion of the time when you jam, and you have effective nut hands some portion of the time that play poorly. You're going to find that is a consistent theme, that the hands you are jamming with they have equity, but they don't play particularly well post-flop. And like ace king, you may say, doesn't ace king play well? Well, no, because if you don't get an ace or a king, you're going to have a rough go at it. What about jacks and tens? Well, if the overcards come, you're going to have a rough go at it. So anyway, I did include these here because the solver has them, and it's important to realize that, like right in this scenario, we're playing only, 13% of hands. So roughly 10% of the time, 1.2 divided by 13, you should be jamming all in, which is a relevant amount. It's not irrelevant. So it's included. All right, so that's the strategy in these scenarios. Let's take a look at the later positions. As you see, again, still not a whole lot of jamming against the earlier positions, and that's because early positions should have a strong range. So one big takeaway here is you don't want to jam all that often against ranges that should be strong. So as an exploitative strategy, you can jam over people who raise too wide. I discussed this thoroughly in my very first poker book, Secrets to Professional Tournament Poker, about how if someone's raising too wide, you get to jam over them very, 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 very frequently. I remember in the book, I was going back through editing it recently, and there's a spot where I say something like, say hijack raises, cut off calls, and you have 25 big blinds on the button. take hands on the cusp of playability and just rip them all in. Like 10-8 offsuit, I think is the hand I used. That's quite aggressive. I would not be doing that today. But that's because people have learned to play better today. And they'll call off more appropriately. But back in the day, people would raise really wide from late position. And then they'd fold too often. So if they're going to raise with like 50% of hands from the hijack seat, and they're going to fold all but like the top 6% of them, they're folding, 80% of the time, 85% of the time. You can just demolish them by jamming very wide, and that's fantastic. But against early position raisers, under the gun +1, under the gun +2, low jack, hijack, those raisers, they're going to have something pretty good. So you can't just jam on them super wide. And as you see, jamming ranges across the board against these positions are pretty tight. You see against low jack even, you're only jamming ace, king, ace, queen, king, jack suited, queen, jack suited, pocket tens, right? We do get to start jamming wider, though, whenever we are on button versus cutoff. Because now cutoff's raising with a wider range, so the button gets to jam with a wider range, right? That makes logical sense. Notice also the 3-betting range is usually going to be very polarized, right? So we see here just like really good hands up top, 3-betting for value, and then ace-9 offsuit and king-6 suited, 3-betting with the intention of folding. Someone sent me an email recently saying, if you 3-bet with these hands in blue, which ones are you calling with if you get jammed on? And the answer is that should be very, very obvious and intuitive, right? Because, well, some of them are bad and some of them are good. So, like right here, it's just very easy to see. You call off with the good ones, you fold the bad ones. Over here, you call off with the good ones, fold the bad ones. Over here, call off the good ones, fold the bad ones. And that's going to be fine. And then you see a pretty wide calling range. That's because, again, we're playing 25 big blinds deep, right? So you see lots of hands calling. One thing you may be a little bit uncomfortable with is, like, say button or cutoff raises, you're on the button. Like, I'm really not calling king-7 suited, queen-8 suited, 10-8 suited, etc. And maybe we should be calling more in these scenarios. We should be calling more in these scenarios. If anything, you should very often just be playing a little bit wider than GTO ranges recommend, because when you're in position, because most people just play poorly whenever they're going to be out of position post-flop. So we should perhaps even be playing slightly wider than this. And the nice thing about these charts is that it's kind of intuitive to figure out if you wanted to widen your range a little bit, what would we do? Right? It's important to have a strategy like this. Which hands are on the cusp? Well, 2s, jack 8 suited, queen 7 suited, king 6 suited, king 5 suited, queen 10, jack 10, ace 8, 10, 9, right? It's pretty obvious if we wanted to add more hands to our range, we would start 3-betting those hands instead, and then calling with some of the bottom hands that are currently in blue, right? So all of this is pretty nice and intuitive, but you see now we're not rejamming much at all, right? And this is where I really get unhappy with other people out there who try to say you can just use a rejamming strategy only, because take a look at this, right? Let's take cutoff versus low jack. You see, we're actually flat calling with, what is this? I can't see it very well. 10% of hands. And we're jamming or 3-betting only a total of 6, right? Or 7. So that means that over half the time, we are supposed to be flatting. Yet, some people are saying, just jam or fold, don't worry about it. Sure, it's easier, but it's just leaving loads of money on the table. I don't know the math off the top of my head, but in this scenario, low jack versus cutoff, or cutoff versus low jack, you may only be able to jam or fold using that strategy with something like, 12% of hands? So that means you get to play 33% fewer hands than the actual good strategy, right? And again, these are not perfect GTO strategies, but they are very, very, very close. All the percentages line up, which is by far the most important thing. Chris says, for middle position, if you have a hand that's a decent hand to flat, but you know your table is prone to flat too much, should you jam more often? Well, the nice thing about the flatting hands is that all of these hands in green, let's take a look at from like hijack seat, right? All these hands in green flop really well, right? Like if I have pocket 9s, I don't care if a lot of people see the flop. If I have king 10 suited, I don't care if a lot of people see the flop. If I have same thing with aces, right? All these hands flop really well. So no, you're happy to see a flop wide in that scenario. So I think the answer to that is no. Now, if you know the initial raiser is going to fold too often to the re-raise, then sure, right? Then that's when you could start jamming slightly more. If you think the raisers are going to call a little bit more often, well, you should definitely not then, right? So I don't think it's all that bad to call with the hands that don't mind seeing a flop. And really, all these hands in green, I mean, for the most part, really all the hands in green, you see it's just a load of suited hands and pairs. Suited hands don't care if they're multi-way. Pairs don't care if they're multi-way. I mean, yeah, whenever you call a pocket nines and 4 other people call, you're set mining, but that's fine. You're allowed to set mine. And if you do flop an overpair, then often it goes okay. All right, here we have small blind strategy and big blind strategy. Right? You see, same pattern as before. We're just playing much wider. Even here, though, against early position, we have almost no all-in range, right? And you see it gets bigger and bigger and bigger as our opponent gets in later and later position. Same story, big blind versus under the gun, big blind versus low jack versus cutoff versus button. You see the all-in range gets bigger, 3%, 7%, 10%, 12%, right? So that is nice and consistent. You see still the same very polarized 3-betting strategy, right? Small blind versus under the gun, our 3-betting range is just the absolute best hands, and then some bluffs, right? So all of these patterns seem to line up very, very consistently, and that really does just allow you to develop frameworks and points to take away from these. Against early position raisers, or anyone who has a strong range, don't get too out of line. Against late position raisers, or anyone prone to have a wide range, then you get to start jamming much wider, right? As you see, again, the hands you want to jam with the most are often the hands that have plenty of equity but don't flop especially well. Like right here, big blind versus button's a good example, where we're jamming these ace-X hands. And again, if we're looking at straight GTO strategy, I'm sure all of these ace-X offsuits are jammed some percentage of the time and called some percentage of the time. Like right here, king 7 suited, king 6 suited, I'm sure king 8 suited and king 5 suited are jammed some portion of the time. But again, we're just making it easy for all of you, keeping the percentages lined up. And this all works out pretty nicely, right? And that's fine and good. Here we have blind versus blind strategy. We're not going to go into that too much, though. You can study that on your own if you'd like. But you do see here, for example, big blind versus small blind limp. Big blind should be jamming relatively few hands, but it makes sense that they want to be jamming decent ace-X. It's okay. And small pairs that are likely best, but don't mind fold equity. And then same story. They are raising small with the best hands and some stone bluffs. And as you see, here's the strategy, very, very intuitive. Call with the good hands when you get jammed on, fold the bad hands. Big blind versus, okay, yeah, that's a different chart. All right, so yeah. Here we have the small blind chart. You see we tried to combine it into one. Combining charts into one make them easier to read at the table because there's only one image, but it's also like easier to, or more difficult to read in game, right? At least in my mind. Anyway, small blind strategy, raising with the best hands in blue and then calling off with them, obviously. Raising and then folding this marginal range. Limping and then jamming all in with the hands in gray. Limping and calling the hands in orange. Limping and folding the hands in pink. And all of this does make nice, logical sense. Also, just open jamming a tiny portion of hands. Kind of like the range of big blind jams over small blind limp, right? You see, similar pattern. So, exploitatively, you should rejam wider than GTO against players who raise and then fold to an all-in too often. And this will usually just be the loose raisers, as I already explained. You do not get too out of line from early and middle position, though, due to the presence of players yet to act. So, let's say you just know someone raises with 30% of hands from all positions, okay? They're too tight from late position. They're too loose from under the gun. Against these players, if they raise under the gun and you're under the gun +1, you still can't get all that out of line, right? Because if you get out of line, you have to worry about all the other players yet to act. That's very different than if they fold to the player on the button. And now, you know they still only raise with 30% of hands. You should actually be way tighter than the GTO charts list because the GTO charts presume your opponent's raising with about 50% of hands from the button, not 30, right? So you always want to be aware of what your opponents are doing because if you well, anytime you're using solvers, if you input the wrong information, you're going to get a very wrong output. And that's something else a lot of people do not quite understand. They think that whatever information they input is definitively correct. And it's just not, I hate to break it to you, that us humans input wrong information. So all you can do is put the best information you can. But if you know how to play if your opponent plays perfectly, and you know what the perfect strategy, the perfect response is, which is what all of these charts assume, you can adjust them very intuitively based on the differences that your opponent, or the different ways your opponent plays compared to GTO. Also, you want to rejam tighter. This program doesn't like the word rejam either. Rejam tighter than GTO against players who raise and then call an all-in too often. And those are usually going to be the tight raisers, but not always. There are players who will raise tighter than normal, but then still fold a lot. Like, for example, say someone, instead of raising 50% of hands on the button, they raise 40% of hands on the button. But instead of calling off with whatever the correct portion is, which is going to be decently wide, really, let's say they only call off like 6% of hands. Well, now you can jam all over them probably with any two cards. Anytime your opponents only call off with just a super nuts when they started with a reasonably wide range, you can just demolish them by jamming very wide. So if that's going to be the case, and you can jam on a tight raiser very frequently. So it's not just as easy as don't jam over tight raisers. But in general, tight raisers start with tighter ranges, and then they just know not to fold, pocket eights, right? If you raise and they're folding, if you raise pocket eights and someone jams on you, like you're on the button there in the small blind, I mean, most people know to call it off there. So unless they're making really, really big folds, then you should be a little bit cautious. But yeah, so that's it. There are definitely spots in tournaments where you really want to avoid getting action at all. Usually this is going to be in bubble scenarios or final table scenarios. This is why you often see someone raising to 2 big blinds and then someone just like ripping it in for 30 big blinds with ace king or pocket nines or something like that, because you really don't want to 3-bet and then get jammed on. So there are certainly ICM scenarios where you want to avoid getting flat called, but that's a big scenario. That's a big topic. That's a final table topic, and I'm sure you can look at all my work on final tables and we discuss that. And if you all want to go in more in depth than that in the future, just send me an email with the specific question and we will discuss it. Hello everyone, I am Jonathan Little, and I want to thank you for watching this Thanksgiving Day marathon. I hope you are learning a lot. Let me take a minute to tell you about the classes aspect of Poker Coaching Premium. There we have over 110 premium classes where I and the other coaches at PokerCoaching.com go through numerous aspects of poker. For example, we have sections on pre-flop play, post-flop play, adjustments to specific opponents, finances, mindset, the fundamentals, and much, much more. And in addition to these 110 classes we have, we upload at least 2 new ones every single month. So you're going to be getting a lot of additional content consistently throughout the course of your membership. Over the next year, for example, on Poker Coaching Premium, we're going to be adding over 300 new hand quizzes on top of the 650 we already have, 24 new videos, 12 live challenge webinars where I ask you an in-depth question and make you tell me how you would play your entire range on the pre-flop, flop, turn, and river. And then also 48 additional live coaching webinars featuring some of the absolute best poker players in the world who I hired because, well, I wanted to learn from them and I wanted to learn how to improve my skills from them so that I could improve, right? And fortunately, I'm in a spot where I can take all of that and share it with all of you as Poker Coaching Premium members. Normally, Poker Coaching is $99 a month, but for Black Friday, I'm going to let you get it for $599. This is by far the cheapest price you're ever going to be able to get it at, so take advantage of this special sale. You can do that right now at pokercoaching.com/Black Friday. Hope you continue enjoying the marathon. Have a great holiday, and I will talk to you later.